Before the first American Marine ever set foot on a Pacific island, the Japanese Imperial forces already believed they knew exactly what kind of enemy they would face. In their view, the outcome of any future confrontation had already been decided, not by weapons or numbers, but by character. The Japanese military culture of the early 20th century was shaped by a deeply ingrained belief in spiritual superiority. The soldier of the emperor was taught from the beginning that discipline, obedience, and the willingness to die were the highest virtues a warrior could possess. To surrender was not merely a failure, it was dishonor, a stain that extended beyond the individual to his family, his unit, and even his ancestors. This belief system, often summarized under the term Bushido, was not just philosophy. It was doctrine. It shaped training, tactics, and expectations on the battlefield. Japanese soldiers were conditioned to endure extreme hardship. Hunger, exhaustion, isolation, these were not obstacles to be avoided, but trials to be embraced. Pain was seen as a test of loyalty. Death, if it came in service of the emperor, was considered the ultimate fulfillment of duty. Against this worldview, Western armies were seen as fundamentally weaker. American soldiers, in particular, were viewed with contempt. Japanese intelligence assessments before the war described Americans as soft, individualistic, and overly reliant on technology. They believed American troops lacked the spiritual fortitude required for prolonged combat in harsh conditions. Comfort, in their eyes, had made them fragile. The Pacific theater itself reinforced this confidence. The islands were unforgiving. Dense jungles, suffocating heat, relentless humidity, disease, insects, and isolation created an environment that punished the unprepared. Japanese planners believed that even if Americans could bring superior firepower, they would crumble under these conditions. The expectation was clear: the Americans would lose their will. This belief was not entirely unfounded. Early encounters between Japanese forces and Western colonial armies in Asia had often ended in Japanese victories. European units had withdrawn or collapsed under pressure, reinforcing the idea that spiritual resolve mattered more than material strength. To Japanese commanders, the war ahead was not a test of tactics, it was a test of endurance and willpower. And they were convinced they held the advantage. American Marines, on the other hand, were largely untested in modern amphibious warfare on this scale. Many were young. Many had never seen combat. To Japanese observers, they looked exactly as expected: inexperienced, unfamiliar with the terrain, dependent on supply lines that stretched across an ocean. The assumption was that once these Marines faced sustained resistance, night attacks, close-quarters jungle fighting, constant pressure, they would break. This miscalculation would prove catastrophic. What the Japanese failed to understand was that American military culture, while very different from their own, possessed a strength they did not recognize: adaptability. American Marines were not trained to die for ideology. They were trained to accomplish missions and survive long enough to complete the next one. Their discipline did not come from fear of dishonor, but from trust in training, in leadership, and in the men fighting beside them. They did not believe themselves invincible. And that made them dangerous. Unlike the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Army, Marine units encouraged initiative at lower levels. Non-commissioned officers were expected to make decisions under pressure. Junior officers were taught to adjust plans when reality changed. Failure was not shameful, repeating it was. This mindset would become decisive in the Pacific. But before that reality emerged, the Japanese remained confident. They prepared defenses not just to stop the enemy, but to crush his spirit. They favored night attacks, infiltration, sudden close-range assaults, tactics designed to terrify and disorient. They believed American troops, unused to such methods, would panic. They underestimated the Marine Corps' culture of cohesion. Marines fought as units. They trained together, lived together, suffered together. When fear came, and it always did, it was absorbed by the group rather than allowed to spread. No man fought alone. The Japanese belief in invincibility also led to strategic arrogance. Defensive positions were sometimes held to the last man, even when withdrawal might have preserved combat power. Success was measured not in territory held, but in bodies sacrificed. Against an enemy willing to endure casualties in order to advance methodically, this approach would fail. Yet at the outset, none of this was obvious. The Pacific War began with stunning Japanese successes. Pearl Harbor. The rapid expansion across Southeast Asia. The collapse of Allied positions. Each victory reinforced the belief that the enemy lacked resolve. American forces, reeling from early losses, appeared disorganized and reactive. From the Japanese perspective, the pattern was repeating itself. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. American commanders were observing, learning, adjusting. The Marines were studying Japanese tactics, their reliance on night assaults, their use of terrain, their psychological warfare. Every encounter became a lesson. The Japanese, confident in their moral superiority, did not believe such adaptation could overcome spiritual weakness. They were wrong. What they mistook for softness was, in fact, patience. American Marines were not in a hurry to prove anything. They were there to fight, learn, and win, not gloriously, but decisively. The myth of Japanese invincibility rested on the assumption that no enemy could endure what they endured. What followed would shatter that assumption. Soon, Japanese forces would encounter American Marines who did not flee in the jungle, who did not collapse under hunger, who did not retreat after night attacks. They would encounter Marines who held their ground, who adapted, who returned after losses. And slowly, island by island, the belief that Americans would break began to erode. But that realization did not come all at once. It began quietly. On a remote island called Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal was never meant to be a proving ground for legends. It was a remote, jungle-covered island in the Solomon Chain, barely known to the wider world before 1942. Yet it was there, in heat, mud, disease, and darkness, that the Japanese imperial forces encountered something they had not anticipated, an enemy who would not collapse. When American Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, the operation itself surprised the Japanese. Until that moment, the Imperial Navy and Army had been on the offensive, expanding rapidly across the Pacific. The idea that the Americans would strike back so soon, and with such force, was unexpected. Still, surprise did not equal fear. Japanese commanders believed the landing force could be isolated, harassed, and eventually destroyed. The terrain favored the defender. The jungle was thick, visibility was limited, and the climate punished any soldier unprepared for prolonged exposure. Japanese troops were experienced in these conditions. The Americans, they believed, were not. At first glance, the situation seemed to confirm their assumptions. The Marines who landed were exhausted almost immediately. Supplies were limited. Heavy equipment was scarce. The island itself was hostile, oppressive heat during the day, chilling dampness at night, insects everywhere, and disease spreading quickly. Malaria, dysentery, and exhaustion took their toll. Japanese planners saw opportunity. Their doctrine emphasized night attacks, sudden, violent assaults designed to exploit fear and confusion. They believed Americans, unfamiliar with fighting in darkness and close jungle terrain, would panic. The jungle would magnify every sound. Every shadow would become a threat. And so, the attacks began. Under cover of darkness, Japanese infantry moved silently through the jungle. They struck suddenly, often screaming to disorient their enemy. Bayonets flashed. Gunfire erupted at close range. The intent was not just to kill, but to break morale. What they encountered instead was resistance. American Marines did not flee. They were shaken. They were frightened. Many had never experienced combat like this. But they held their positions. They returned fire. They clung to their perimeter around Henderson Field, the airstrip that had become the heart of the campaign. This was the first shock. The Marines did not possess the spiritual fatalism the Japanese expected. They did not fight to die. They fought to survive, and survival demanded discipline. Unit cohesion proved decisive. Marines fought shoulder to shoulder, relying on pre-established fields of fire and mutual support. When one man fell, another filled the gap. Machine guns remained in position. Rifles stayed trained on likely avenues of approach. Fear was present, but it did not spread unchecked. The Japanese, accustomed to enemies breaking under night assaults, began encountering something unfamiliar, an enemy who adapted even while under attack. After each engagement, American commanders made adjustments. Defensive lines were improved. Listening posts were established. Artillery support was coordinated more effectively. Marines learned to anticipate Japanese movement through the jungle. The Japanese attacks, once terrifyingly effective, began to lose momentum. Yet Guadalcanal was not won quickly. The battle dragged on for months. Supplies were scarce on both sides. Japanese attempts to reinforce the island were hampered by American naval and air power. Food became dangerously limited. Soldiers on both sides fought hunger as fiercely as they fought each other. For the Marines, endurance became the defining challenge. They lived in mud. They slept in shallow foxholes. They fought disease, insects, and constant fatigue. There were no rear areas free from danger. The front line was everywhere. The Japanese believed such conditions would erode American morale. Instead, they hardened it. Marines developed a grim determination. Survival depended on routine, discipline, and trust in one another. Small victories mattered, holding a ridge, repelling an attack, surviving another night. Gradually, something shifted. Japanese troops began to notice that their attacks no longer produced the expected results. Marines did not abandon positions. They did not scatter. Even after heavy casualties, the defensive line held. Reports filtered up the Japanese chain of command describing an enemy that fought differently than expected. An enemy that absorbed punishment without disintegrating. The belief that Americans lacked endurance began to crack. One of the most unsettling realizations for Japanese commanders was the Marines' ability to learn quickly. Tactics that worked once became less effective each time they were used. Surprise diminished. Ambushes met prepared responses. The jungle, once considered an ally, became contested ground. American patrols pushed outward. They probed Japanese positions. They gathered intelligence. They denied the Japanese freedom of movement they had once enjoyed. This was not the behavior of a demoralized enemy. Night attacks continued, but they became more costly for the attackers. Marines learned to conserve ammunition, to wait until targets were clear, to coordinate defensive fires. Artillery and mortars responded rapidly to contact. Japanese casualties mounted. As weeks passed, hunger and disease began to weaken Japanese units more severely than their American counterparts. American supply, while imperfect, continued to function. Aircraft operating from Henderson Field disrupted Japanese reinforcement and resupply efforts. This logistical advantage mattered. The Marines were not comfortable, but they were sustained. The Japanese, increasingly isolated, began to experience something unfamiliar: doubt. Not doubt in their courage, but doubt in their assumptions. The Americans were not retreating. They were not collapsing. They were still there. By the later stages of the campaign, Japanese commanders recognized that the destruction of the American force on Guadalcanal was no longer realistic. The initiative had shifted. The Marines began advancing. Each advance was cautious, methodical, supported by firepower and planning. They did not rush. They did not seek dramatic breakthroughs. They sought control. For Japanese soldiers accustomed to offensive momentum, this steady pressure was deeply unsettling. The Americans did not need to overwhelm them in a single blow. They wore them down. Guadalcanal ended not with a grand surrender, but with a quiet evacuation. Japanese forces withdrew under cover of darkness, conceding the island. The significance of the defeat extended far beyond its strategic value. Guadalcanal shattered a myth. For the first time, Japanese forces had faced an enemy who endured everything the jungle, the night, and the battlefield could deliver, and did not yield. The Marines had proven something fundamental. They could survive. They could adapt. And they could hold. From that moment on, Japanese planners no longer assumed American troops would break. They began preparing for something far more dangerous, an enemy who would return, stronger and wiser, with each battle. The fear did not arrive suddenly. It began quietly. On Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal taught the Marines a brutal truth: in the Pacific, the jungle was not just terrain, it was an enemy. It concealed movement, distorted sound, swallowed visibility, and punished every mistake. Survival depended not on strength alone, but on learning how to exist within an environment that seemed determined to erase human presence altogether. The Japanese had built much of their confidence on mastery of this environment. They believed the jungle favored patience, stealth, and spiritual endurance, qualities they assumed Western soldiers lacked. What they did not anticipate was how quickly American Marines would begin to change the way they fought. Learning came at a cost. Early patrols often ended in ambush. Units moved too loudly, underestimated distances, or misread terrain. Mistakes were punished immediately. Yet unlike an army bound by rigid doctrine, the Marine Corps treated these failures as instruction. Every patrol report was studied. Every engagement was dissected. What worked was reinforced. What failed was discarded. The jungle demanded decentralization. Large formations were ineffective. Visibility was too limited. Control had to shift downward, to squad leaders and platoon commanders operating with incomplete information. Marines learned to operate in smaller units, moving cautiously, communicating silently, and trusting initiative. This adjustment unsettled Japanese forces. They had expected Americans to rely on mass and firepower alone. Instead, they began encountering small, disciplined Marine patrols that moved deliberately through terrain once thought impenetrable. Defensive doctrine evolved as well. Rather than holding thin lines, Marines developed defenses in depth. Positions overlapped. Fields of fire were carefully planned. Listening posts and ambush points extended outward from main perimeters. The jungle was no longer ceded to the enemy at night. Japanese night attacks, once terrifyingly effective, increasingly ran into prepared resistance. Marines learned to wait. They resisted the instinct to fire blindly. They conserved ammunition. They allowed attackers to move into kill zones. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery were coordinated to respond quickly and decisively. Discipline replaced panic. The Japanese noticed. What had once been chaotic firefights became controlled engagements. Attacks that relied on surprise lost their effectiveness. The jungle, once an advantage, became contested ground. American adaptability extended beyond tactics. Equipment was modified. Weapons were cleaned obsessively to prevent malfunctions in humidity. Marines learned to travel light, carrying only what was essential. They adjusted uniforms, improvised camouflage, and altered routines to match the rhythm of the environment. Medical practices improved as well. Field sanitation reduced disease. Wounds were treated faster. Evacuation procedures became more efficient. These changes mattered. Japanese doctrine emphasized endurance through willpower. American doctrine increasingly emphasized endurance through systems. The difference became stark. Marines were not immune to fear or exhaustion. But they were supported by a structure that acknowledged human limits and compensated for them. Rest rotations, resupply efforts, and medical care preserved combat effectiveness over time. Japanese units, often isolated and undersupplied, relied heavily on individual toughness. When food ran out or reinforcements failed to arrive, units simply endured, until they could not. As the campaign progressed beyond Guadalcanal, these lessons traveled with the Marines. Each new island presented variations of the same challenge: dense vegetation, hidden defenders, sudden violence. But Marines arrived better prepared, less naive, more cautious. Japanese commanders began to encounter a new kind of enemy, one that no longer stumbled blindly into traps. Patrols clashed in the jungle with increasing frequency. These encounters were often brief, violent, and decisive. Marines moved with purpose. They covered one another. They withdrew when necessary and returned when conditions favored them. The jungle ceased to be a place of mystery. It became a battlefield. Japanese soldiers began to recognize patterns. American patrols appeared at unexpected times and locations. Defensive positions were probed repeatedly until weaknesses were identified. Attacks were supported by precise artillery and airstrikes. This was not reckless aggression. It was methodical pressure. One of the most unsettling developments for Japanese forces was the Marines' use of combined arms in jungle warfare. Coordinating infantry, artillery, and air support in such terrain was considered extremely difficult, yet the Americans managed it with increasing effectiveness. Radio operators became critical. Forward observers guided fire with precision. When contact was made, support followed quickly. The jungle no longer shielded Japanese positions as it once had. The psychological impact was significant. Japanese soldiers had believed that close terrain would neutralize American advantages. Instead, they found those advantages adapted and refined. Firepower was no longer blunt, it was targeted. Reports began to describe American units as cautious but relentless. They did not rush into danger. They studied it, then dismantled it. This approach eroded Japanese confidence. The Americans were not afraid of the jungle anymore. They respected it. And respect led to mastery. The contrast in command philosophy grew sharper. Marine leaders encouraged feedback. Patrol leaders reported what they saw. Adjustments followed quickly. The organization learned as a whole. Japanese doctrine, by contrast, changed slowly. Tradition weighed heavily. Deviating from established methods was often discouraged. As a result, Japanese units found themselves fighting an enemy who improved with each encounter, while their own methods remained largely unchanged. The jungle, once the great equalizer, became a test of learning. The Marines passed. By the time later battles unfolded, Japanese forces no longer assumed environmental superiority guaranteed success. The Americans had proven they could fight, survive, and win under the same conditions. This realization did not bring panic. But it brought respect. And respect, in war, often precedes fear. The Marines had learned to fight the jungle. Next, they would face a battlefield even more unforgiving, one where there would be no cover, no concealment, and no retreat. A small coral island called Tarawa. If Guadalcanal was where the Japanese learned the Americans would not break, Tarawa was where they realized the Americans would advance, even when logic, losses, and terrain all argued against it. Tarawa was small. Barely more than a strip of coral and sand. No jungle to hide movement. No darkness to conceal positions. Every inch of ground was exposed, visible, and deadly. For the Japanese defenders, it was an ideal killing ground. The island of Bidio had been transformed into a fortress. Bunkers were dug deep into reinforced concrete. Artillery pieces were positioned to cover the beaches. Machine gun nests overlapped fields of fire with mathematical precision. Japanese planners believed no enemy could survive a frontal assault here. The Americans would have to cross open water, wade ashore under direct fire, and advance without cover. If ever there was a place where morale could be shattered instantly, Tarawa was it. The Japanese did not expect a battle. They expected a massacre. On November 20, 1943, U.S. Marines began their assault. From the moment the first landing craft approached the reef, reality diverged from planning. A miscalculation in tide levels left many boats grounded far from shore. Marines were forced to disembark early, wading hundreds of yards through shallow water. They were fully exposed. Machine gun fire ripped across the lagoon. Artillery shells detonated among the landing waves. Men fell before ever reaching the beach. For the Japanese defenders, this was confirmation. The enemy had been caught in the open. The assumptions held true. But the Marines kept moving. Wounded men dragged themselves forward. Others carried them. Units that lost leaders reorganized instinctively. Small groups pressed on independently, seeking any scrap of cover. There was no panic. Only forward motion. The beach itself offered little relief. Sand provided no protection from bullets. Japanese bunkers remained intact, firing relentlessly. Casualties mounted at a staggering rate. Yet Marines continued to land. Wave after wave. Japanese defenders began to notice something unsettling. Despite catastrophic losses, the Americans did not abandon the assault. They did not retreat to regroup. They adapted on the move. Naval gunfire was redirected. Engineers improvised methods to breach bunkers. Tanks, once thought unusable on coral terrain, were brought ashore and pushed forward under fire. The fighting devolved into brutal, close-quarters combat. Bunkers were assaulted one by one. Flamethrowers, grenades, and demolitions were used to neutralize positions that refused to fall. Each bunker was a small battle of its own. This was not chaos. It was determination refined by discipline. Japanese soldiers, trained to fight to the death, met an enemy equally willing to close distance under fire, not out of fanaticism, but out of necessity. For the first time, Japanese defenders saw American troops accept staggering losses and continue the mission without hesitation. This was not the behavior they had anticipated. Tarawa was not won quickly. It was won inch by inch, bunker by bunker, at tremendous cost. The battle lasted only 76 hours, but for those involved, it felt endless. By the end, nearly the entire Japanese garrison had been destroyed. The Marines paid a heavy price. Casualties shocked the American public when photographs emerged, images of bodies on beaches, of wrecked landing craft, of wounded men fighting on. For Japanese observers, the lesson was different. They had inflicted exactly the kind of losses they believed would break the enemy. And it had not worked. Tarawa forced a re-evaluation. The Japanese had believed that courage under fire belonged exclusively to those prepared to die without retreat. What they witnessed instead was a different kind of courage, the willingness to advance into overwhelming danger with no illusion of glory, driven purely by duty and cohesion. American Marines did not attack because they were fearless. They attacked because stopping was not an option. Japanese defenders also recognized the efficiency that followed initial chaos. Once footholds were established, American coordination became overwhelming. Fire support was precise. Movement was systematic. Every success was exploited. Tarawa demonstrated that even the most formidable defenses could be dismantled by an enemy willing to endure losses long enough to adapt. The psychological impact extended beyond the island. Japanese commanders now understood that static defenses, no matter how strong, could not guarantee victory. The Americans would find a way through, or over, or under. The myth that mass casualties would deter them was gone. Fear began to replace confidence. Not fear of brutality, but fear of inevitability. If the Americans were willing to pay such a price for a small island, what would they do for larger objectives? Tarawa answered a question the Japanese had not wanted to ask. How do you stop an enemy who refuses to stop? The answer, it seemed, was unclear. The Marines left Tarawa bloodied but victorious. They carried its lessons forward, improving amphibious tactics, refining coordination, reducing future losses. The Japanese carried a different lesson. The Americans could not be shocked into retreat. They could not be intimidated into hesitation. They would keep coming. And they were learning with every battle. The next test would push this reality even further, on an island whose defenses were designed not to stop the enemy at the shore, but to bleed him slowly until his will collapsed. That island was Iwo Jima. If Tarawa shattered Japanese confidence in static defenses, Iwo Jima destroyed the belief that endurance alone could decide a battle. What unfolded on that small volcanic island was not a contest of courage, both sides possessed it in abundance, but a test of whose system, discipline, and resolve could survive prolonged, methodical destruction. Iwo Jima was different from anything the Marines had faced before. There was no jungle to mask movement. No vegetation to absorb sound. The ground itself was hostile, soft volcanic ash that offered no traction and no cover. Every step was exhausting. Every position was exposed. For the Japanese defenders, the island was a masterpiece of preparation. Instead of defending the beaches, they built a vast underground network. Tunnels connected bunkers, pillboxes, and artillery positions. Units could move unseen, reoccupy positions thought destroyed, and strike from unexpected directions. The goal was not to repel the landing. The goal was to break the Marines over time. Japanese doctrine on Iwo Jima abandoned dramatic counterattacks. There would be no mass charges. No waste of manpower. Every Marine advance would be met with precise, deliberate resistance. From the moment the Marines landed in February 1945, it was clear this would be different. The beaches were eerily quiet. Then the fire began. Hidden artillery, mortars, and machine guns opened from every direction. Marines struggled to move forward through the ash, weighed down by equipment, unable to dig meaningful cover. Casualties mounted quickly. Yet the Marines did not retreat. They reorganized. Small units moved forward when possible, halted when necessary, and called in fire support to neutralize unseen threats. Progress was painfully slow, measured in yards per day. Japanese defenders waited patiently, allowing Marines to advance before opening fire. Positions thought destroyed reactivated. The battlefield felt alive, hostile, and unyielding. The psychological strain was immense. There was no front line, danger came from beneath the ground, from behind, from positions not yet discovered. Sleep was scarce. The constant tension eroded nerves. Japanese commanders believed this environment would grind down American morale. Instead, it hardened it. Marines adapted once again. They learned to seal tunnels, to coordinate flamethrowers and demolitions, to advance systematically rather than aggressively. Every position was reduced carefully. This was not heroics. It was procedure. Japanese soldiers, trained to fight to the death, found themselves trapped in a war of attrition they could not win. Their courage remained, but their ability to influence the battle diminished with each lost position. American firepower, once fully coordinated, became overwhelming. Artillery, naval gunfire, and airstrikes pounded suspected positions relentlessly. Still, the Marines advanced slowly. They accepted the pace. Speed was no longer the objective. Control was. One of the most unsettling realizations for Japanese defenders was that American casualties did not change American behavior. Losses were absorbed. Units rotated. Reinforcements arrived. The system continued to function. The Marines did not seek dramatic breakthroughs. They dismantled the island piece by piece. Japanese reports increasingly described the enemy as patient, methodical, and unstoppable. Individual bravery could no longer alter the outcome. The underground network, once an advantage, became a trap. As entrances were sealed and supplies dwindled, defenders faced isolation and inevitable defeat. The famous raising of the flag on Mount Suribachi was not the end of the battle, far from it. Fighting continued for weeks across the northern part of the island. Every hill, every ridge, every tunnel had to be cleared. The Japanese fought until the end. But they fought knowing the outcome was sealed. Iwo Jima forced a painful acknowledgement. The Marines were not fighting for glory. They were not fighting for symbolism. They were fighting to complete the mission, regardless of cost. This was deeply unsettling to an enemy whose doctrine relied on the assumption that losses would erode will. On Iwo Jima, losses did not erode American will. They reinforced it. The Marines demonstrated a form of resolve that did not depend on emotion or ideology. It was rooted in structure, discipline, and the belief that persistence would prevail. By the time the island was secured, the Japanese military had lost more than men. It had lost an assumption. That assumption was simple, that no enemy could endure what they endured. Iwo Jima proved that endurance, when paired with superior coordination and adaptability, was not enough. The Marines left the island exhausted, scarred, and forever changed. The Japanese left behind a battlefield that would become a symbol, not just of sacrifice, but of inevitability. The fear was no longer hypothetical. The Marines would not stop. And there was one final battlefield where this truth would be driven home more brutally than anywhere else. Okinawa. If Iwo Jima proved that the U.S. Marines could not be stopped, Okinawa proved something even more unsettling to the Japanese command: they could not be exhausted. Okinawa was not just another island. It was the gateway to Japan itself. Both sides understood what was at stake. For the Japanese, Okinawa was the final barrier, the last chance to inflict such devastating losses that the enemy would hesitate to invade the homeland. For the Americans, it was a grim preview of what a final confrontation might look like. The battle that followed would be the largest, longest, and bloodiest of the Pacific War. Japanese planners abandoned any illusion of victory through repelling landings at the beach. Instead, they embraced a strategy of prolonged attrition. The goal was not to defeat the Marines outright, but to break them psychologically. Defensive positions were layered deep into ridges, caves, and fortified hills. Every position was designed to delay, bleed, and punish. Withdrawal was planned in advance, not as retreat, but as controlled resistance. The Marines landed in April 1945. At first, the beaches were deceptively quiet. This silence was intentional. The Japanese waited. As American forces pushed inland, resistance increased steadily. Artillery fire, mortars, and sniper attacks came from concealed positions. Progress slowed to a crawl. Rain turned the ground into mud. Equipment sank. Vehicles stalled. Foxholes filled with water. Disease spread. The battlefield became a test of endurance unlike anything before it. The Japanese believed no force could maintain momentum under such conditions. They underestimated the Marines again. What emerged on Okinawa was not reckless assault, but relentless procedure. Marines advanced when possible, paused when necessary, and resumed when conditions allowed. No matter how brutal the resistance, the advance continued. Every hill became a separate battle. Positions were assaulted, cleared, and secured, only to face renewed fire from the next ridge. The Japanese defense forced Marines to fight uphill, into prepared positions, under constant observation. Casualties mounted. Yet the system held. Units rotated. Wounded were evacuated. Supplies flowed forward despite the conditions. Artillery and air support were coordinated with increasing precision. Japanese commanders observed something deeply troubling. Even prolonged suffering did not disrupt American cohesion. Marines fought tired. They fought soaked. They fought wounded. But they fought together. The psychological toll was immense. Okinawa was not a battle of dramatic charges or decisive moments. It was a grinding ordeal that lasted weeks. The Japanese hoped time itself would become their ally. Instead, time favored the Americans. Each day of fighting reduced Japanese combat power. Supplies dwindled. Tunnel networks collapsed. Defensive lines thinned. The Marines, by contrast, absorbed losses without losing structure. Replacement units arrived. Command continuity was preserved. The difference lay not in courage, but in sustainability. Japanese soldiers fought with unquestionable bravery. Many continued fighting until they could no longer physically do so. But bravery could not replace ammunition, food, or medical care. The Marines had those systems. Japanese observers began to acknowledge this reality. Reports described American units as methodical, patient, and unstoppable. They did not chase enemies blindly. They advanced deliberately, securing each position before moving on. Fear emerged not from brutality, but from certainty. The certainty that resistance, no matter how fierce, would only delay the inevitable. Even civilian populations caught in the battle recognized the pattern. The Americans did not withdraw. They did not abandon positions. They returned again and again until resistance was gone. The psychological impact of Okinawa extended far beyond the battlefield. Japanese leadership recognized that if such a force reached the home islands, the cost would be catastrophic. The Marines had proven they could endure months of relentless combat without collapsing. Okinawa did not end with a dramatic surrender. It ended with exhaustion, devastation, and the quiet realization that the Americans could not be broken by suffering alone. For Japanese forces, Okinawa represented the final confirmation. The Marines were not fighting for honor in the traditional sense. They were fighting to finish the war. And they would endure anything required to do so. Respect emerged where confidence once existed. Respect for an enemy whose discipline did not falter under prolonged misery. Respect for a system that preserved fighting capability where individual heroism alone could not. The fear was now complete. Not fear of death, Japanese soldiers had long accepted that. But fear of inevitability. The Marines would arrive. They would stay. And they would advance. Okinawa left no room for doubt. The final realization would come after the war, when Japanese veterans, reflecting on defeat, spoke not of hatred, but of acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the Marines had faced everything the Pacific could offer, and endured. When the Pacific War finally ended, silence followed a conflict defined by noise, fire, and suffering. For the Japanese soldiers who survived, the war did not end with a single moment of realization, but with years of reflection. In that reflection, one truth emerged with striking clarity. The fear they came to associate with the U.S. Marines was not born of brutality or cruelty. It was born of certainty. From the earliest assumptions made before the war, Japanese planners had believed that victory would belong to those who possessed superior spiritual resolve. They believed that hardship would break the enemy. That suffering would erode discipline. That fear would cause collapse. What they encountered instead was a force whose strength did not depend on ideology alone, but on cohesion, adaptability, and endurance supported by systems. The Marines were not fearless. They were dependable. This distinction mattered. Japanese soldiers had been taught that courage was proven through willingness to die. Marines demonstrated a different model, courage expressed through persistence, through returning to the line after loss, through advancing again after failure. This was deeply unsettling. Across the Pacific, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, the pattern repeated itself. Marines arrived inexperienced, learned under fire, adapted rapidly, and became increasingly effective. Each battle refined their approach. Defeat did not discourage them. It instructed them. Japanese veterans later described American forces as calm under pressure. Not because they felt no fear, but because fear did not dominate decision-making. Orders were followed. Units remained intact. Fire support arrived when needed. Even in defeat, the Japanese recognized the professionalism of the enemy. The fear of the Marines was not rooted in hatred. It was rooted in respect. Respect for an enemy that did not rely on reckless charges or blind aggression. Respect for a force that advanced deliberately, accepted losses without panic, and refused to abandon objectives. The Marines fought without illusion. They did not believe themselves invincible. They believed in procedure, in coordination, and in the certainty that persistence would prevail. Japanese doctrine, built on the assumption that willpower alone could decide battles, proved insufficient against such an opponent. The Marines represented a modern form of warfare, one where logistics, intelligence, communication, and adaptability mattered as much as individual bravery. This realization reshaped Japanese military thinking in the post-war period. Accounts written after the conflict frequently acknowledged that American forces, particularly the Marines, had mastered the art of sustained combat. They were not shocked into retreat. They were not intimidated into hesitation. They moved forward, step by step, until resistance ended. The Pacific War was fought at unimaginable cost. Lives were lost on both sides. The suffering was profound and lasting. Yet from that suffering emerged lessons that endure. The legacy of the Marines in the Pacific is not one of destruction alone. It is one of discipline under extreme conditions. Of learning under fire. Of perseverance when retreat would have been easier. The Japanese feared the Marines because they could not predict them. They could not exhaust them. And they could not stop them. That fear was not immediate. It grew slowly. From the jungle nights of Guadalcanal. From the exposed beaches of Tarawa. From the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima. From the endless rain and mud of Okinawa. Each battlefield added weight to the realization. By the end, there was no illusion left. The Marines were not fighting to prove superiority. They were fighting to end the war. And once committed, they would see it through. This is why, long after the guns fell silent, Japanese veterans spoke of the Marines not with contempt, but with sober recognition. They had faced an enemy who did not need to shout, threaten, or intimidate. An enemy whose presence alone signaled that the battle would continue, until it was over. That is why they feared the U.S. Marines. Not because they were unstoppable in a single moment. But because they were unstoppable over time.